In the heart of Beijing's Forbidden City, behind walls of vermilion and gold, thousands of women lived in a gilded cage where beauty was currency and silence was survival. They called it paradise, but for the concubines of the Qing dynasty, it was a carefully orchestrated hell where even the act of love became an instrument of humiliation. Tonight, we unveil the disturbing truth behind the imperial bedchamber rituals that reduced women to crawling shadows in the darkness. The year is 1644. The Manchu conquerors have just established the Qing dynasty, bringing with them a system of control so absolute that it would govern China for nearly 3 centuries. Within the newly constructed harems of the Forbidden City, a new order emerges. One that transforms intimacy into ceremony and desire into degradation. This is not a tale of exotic romance or oriental mystique. This is the documented reality of systematic dehumanization, preserved in imperial records and whispered through generations of palace survivors. The imperial harem of the Qing dynasty housed anywhere from 3,000 to 20,000 women at its peak, creating a vast hierarchy of loneliness and competition. These women, selected from across the empire for their beauty, intelligence, or political connections, entered the palace as teenagers, many never to see their families again. They were classified into 8 ranks, from empress down to the lowest palace maids, each rank determining not just their living quarters and daily rations, but their very worth as human beings. The selection process itself was a study in objectification. Young girls, some as young as 13, were stripped naked and examined by palace eunuchs who measured every aspect of their bodies. Their teeth were counted, their breath smelled, their skin scrutinized for the slightest blemish. Those who passed this humiliating inspection were then subjected to months of training in palace etiquette, learning to walk, speak, and exist according to rigid protocols that stripped away their individual identities. Once inside the palace walls, these women discovered that their primary purpose was to wait to be chosen, wait to be summoned, wait for a chance at relevance in a world where they were fundamentally powerless. The emperor's sexual choices were managed by the imperial household department, run by eunuchs who maintained detailed records of every intimate encounter. These castrated men, themselves victims of a brutal system, became the gatekeepers of imperial desire, wielding extraordinary power over the women whose fates they controlled. The nightly selection ritual was a masterpiece of psychological torture disguised as imperial protocol. Each evening, eunuchs would present the emperor with a silver tray containing small wooden tablets, each inscribed with a concubine's name. Like selecting a dish from a menu, the emperor would flip over one tablet, sealing that woman's fate for the night. The chosen concubine had no right to refuse, no opportunity to prepare mentally or emotionally for what was to come. She was simply a name on a piece of wood, waiting to be consumed. When word reached the selected concubine, a carefully choreographed ritual of humiliation would begin. She would be taken to a special preparation chamber where female attendants and eunuchs would strip her completely naked. Every piece of jewelry, every hairpin, every trace of personal identity was removed. This stripping served a dual purpose. It supposedly protected the emperor from hidden weapons, but more importantly, it reduced the woman to her most vulnerable state, a blank canvas for imperial desire. After the stripping came perhaps the most degrading element of the ritual. The naked concubine would be wrapped tightly in a yellow silk blanket or coverlet, rendering her unable to move freely. This practice, documented in numerous palace records, transformed the woman from a person into a package, an object to be delivered. Eunuchs would then carry her on their backs through the dark corridors of the Forbidden City, her face hidden, her body bound, reduced to cargo in her own story of intimacy. The journey through the palace corridors was designed to maximize submission. Carried like a sack of rice on a eunuch's back, the concubine would be transported through checkpoints where more eunuchs verified her identity and recorded her movement. The palace's architecture itself enforced hierarchy. The closer one got to the emperor's bedchamber, the more gates and guards appeared. Each checkpoint was a reminder that this was not a romantic rendezvous, but a state-controlled breeding program wrapped in silk and ceremony. Upon reaching the emperor's bedchamber, the true depth of the humiliation revealed itself. The eunuch would deposit the wrapped concubine at the foot of the emperor's bed, specifically at the foot, never at the side or head. Here, the historical records become particularly disturbing. The concubine was required to shed her silk covering and crawl, yes, crawl on her hands and knees, from the foot of the bed up to where the emperor lay waiting. This crawling was not a suggestion or occasional practice, it was mandatory protocol, designed to reinforce the absolute power dynamic between ruler and subject. The crawling itself had specific rules. The concubine must keep her head lowered, never making eye contact with the emperor unless specifically commanded. She must move slowly, deliberately, giving the emperor time to inspect her form as she approached. Some accounts describe how concubines were trained to make this crawl last exactly the time it took for a specific incense stick to burn down. Too fast showed presumption, too slow showed reluctance. Either could result in punishment. During the intimate encounter itself, the concubine was forbidden from making any sound. No words of affection, no cries of pleasure or pain, no human expression whatsoever was permitted. She was to remain as silent as the silk that had wrapped her, as passive as the wooden tablet that bore her name. The emperor might speak, might issue commands, but the concubine's voice was effectively erased from the encounter. This enforced silence served to further dehumanize the women, reducing them to silent vessels for imperial pleasure. The positioning during intercourse was also rigidly controlled. The concubine was never allowed to be on top of the emperor, as this would symbolically place her above the Son of Heaven. She could not embrace him unless commanded, could not kiss him without permission, could not even adjust her position for comfort without risking severe punishment. Every movement, every breath was monitored by eunuchs who waited just outside the bedchamber, timing the encounter with water clocks and preparing to intervene if it exceeded the prescribed duration. The aftermath of these encounters was perhaps even more disturbing than the acts themselves. As soon as the emperor finished, eunuchs would immediately enter the chamber. The concubine, still naked and vulnerable, would be questioned about the encounter. But the most crucial question came not to her, but to the emperor. Should the dragon's seed be kept? This clinical inquiry about whether the emperor wished for a potential pregnancy to occur would determine what happened next, and the concubine had no say in her own reproductive fate. If the emperor decided against pregnancy, what followed was a form of medical assault that palace records describe in chilling detail. Eunuchs would immediately perform violent massages on the concubine's abdomen and lower back, attempting to expel the semen before conception could occur. These massages were not gentle medical procedures, but brutal poundings that often left women bruised and bleeding. Some accounts describe eunuchs jumping on the women's stomachs or using wooden implements to ensure no imperial seed would take root. The trauma of these forced expulsions extended beyond the physical violence. Many concubines reported that the eunuchs performing these procedures would take advantage of the women's vulnerable state, adding sexual assault to the medical assault. Since the women were already naked and had no authority to resist, some eunuchs used these moments to satisfy their own twisted desires, knowing the women could never report them without risking their own lives. The very men who were supposedly neutered and safe became predators in the shadows of the imperial bedchamber. For concubines who attempted to resist or circumvent these brutal protocols, the consequences were severe. The palace maintained an extensive system of punishments, ranging from the mundane to the monstrous. Minor infractions, such as speaking during intercourse or failing to crawl properly, might result in reduced food rations, confinement to quarters, or beatings with bamboo rods. More serious offenses, such as attempting to seduce the emperor outside of official channels or trying to prevent the forced abortions, could lead to far worse fates. The Cold Palace, a section of the Forbidden City reserved for disgraced concubines, was a particular source of terror. Women sent there were not technically imprisoned, but were effectively erased from existence. They received minimal food, no coal for heating during Beijing's brutal winters, and were forbidden from receiving visitors or sending letters. Many women in the Cold Palace slowly went insane from isolation, while others chose suicide over the endless grey existence of social death. The screams echoing from the Cold Palace served as a warning to other concubines about the price of defiance. Physical punishments for serious infractions were documented with bureaucratic precision in palace records. Concubines who attempted to hide pregnancies or deceive the emperor about their fertility might face the death of 1,000 cuts, where strips of flesh were slowly removed from the body over hours or days. Others were subjected to the wooden donkey, a torture device that combined public humiliation with genital mutilation. Some were simply strangled with silk scarves, a supposedly merciful death that allowed them to die with their bodies intact for the afterlife. In this brutal system, pregnancy became the only path to potential power and security. A concubine who successfully bore the emperor a child, especially a son, could rise dramatically in rank and gain protections that childless women could never achieve. This created a desperate underground economy within the harem where women would trade anything, gold, jewels, information, even their bodies, for a chance at conception. The very eunuchs who were supposed to prevent unauthorized pregnancies became power brokers in this shadow market of fertility. The corruption among eunuchs reached staggering proportions as concubines desperate for pregnancy offered increasingly elaborate bribes. Some eunuchs would deliberately perform ineffective massages after encounters, allowing semen to remain in exchange for payment. Others would falsify records, claiming the emperor had approved a pregnancy when he had not. Still others would arrange secret fertile periods, ensuring concubines were selected during their most likely times for conception. The palace that was supposed to run on absolute order became a maze of conspiracy and corruption, all centered on the biological desperation of trapped women. For concubines who couldn't afford bribes or lacked connections to corrupt eunuchs, alternative strategies emerged. Some would consume traditional fertility herbs and potions, risking poisoning to increase their chances of conception. Others learned to read the emperor's moods and preferences, attempting to please him so thoroughly that he might grant permission for pregnancy in a moment of satisfaction. The most desperate would even attempt to seduce the emperor during their menstrual periods, hoping the blood would be mistaken for virginal bleeding and inspire protective feelings. The menstrual periods themselves became another source of anxiety and control within the harem. Concubines were required to report their cycles to the imperial household department, and being chosen for an encounter during menstruation was not just embarrassing, it could be fatal. The emperor's bed was considered sacred, and contaminating it with menstrual blood was a capital offense. To protect themselves, concubines developed subtle signals, gold rings worn on specific fingers, small red dots painted on their earlobes, or specific flowers worn in their hair to indicate their condition to observant eunuchs. These marking systems, while protective, also became tools of sabotage in the cutthroat world of harem politics. Rival concubines would sometimes steal or swap markers, hoping to trick their enemies into being selected during their periods. Others would bribe palace maids to report false information about competitors' cycles. The constant fear of being chosen at the wrong time led some women to attempt to artificially control their periods through starvation, excessive exercise, or dangerous herbal concoctions that often caused permanent damage to their reproductive systems. The psychological torture of the harem extended beyond the bedchamber rituals. Concubines lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, never knowing when they might be selected, never able to refuse or express preference. Many developed severe anxiety disorders, manifesting in physical symptoms like tremors, hair loss, and digestive problems. The palace physicians, all male eunuchs, often dismissed these ailments as feminine hysteria, prescribing sedatives that left the women even more vulnerable to abuse. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. The lower-ranking concubines lived in dormitories where dozens of women shared close quarters, each wondering if tonight would be her turn to be wrapped and carried like cargo. The sounds of footsteps in the corridor, the jingle of eunuch keys, the whisper of silk being prepared, all became triggers for panic attacks. Some women developed elaborate pre-sleep rituals, attempting to make themselves less attractive to avoid selection. Others did the opposite, spending hours on beauty routines, hoping that tonight would finally be their chance to conceive and escape their lowly status. The rare concubines who did achieve pregnancy faced a new set of challenges and dangers. A pregnant concubine became both precious and threatening, precious to herself and potentially to the emperor if he desired the child, but threatening to every other woman in the harem who saw her advancement as their own diminishment. Poisonings were common, often disguised as pregnancy complications. Accidental falls downstairs, tainted food, and needle-sharp objects hidden in bedding were constant dangers for any woman whose belly began to swell. To protect pregnant concubines, the palace implemented strict protocols that only added to their isolation. They were moved to special quarters, forbidden from eating any food not tested by tasters, and surrounded by guards who watched their every move. The very protections meant to keep them safe became another form of imprisonment. Many pregnant concubines reported feeling like rare animals in a zoo, constantly observed. Their bodies no longer their own, but property of the state, vessels for potential imperial heirs. The birthing process itself was transformed into yet another ritual of control and humiliation. Concubines gave birth in special chambers where every detail was managed by protocol. The position of delivery, the words that could be spoken, even the expressions on the mother's face were dictated by tradition. If the child was a boy, celebrations might follow, and the mother's status would rise. If it was a girl, the disappointment was palpable, and the mother might find herself quickly forgotten, her moment of relevance past. Even successful mothers found their relationships with their children controlled and limited. Imperial children were raised by wet nurses and tutors, not their mothers. A concubine might be allowed brief, supervised visits with her child, but true maternal bonding was seen as dangerous, potentially creating loyalties that could threaten the emperor's absolute authority. Many mothers watched their children grow up from a distance, recognized but never truly known, loved but never truly held. The aging process in the harem was particularly cruel. As concubines grew older and their beauty faded, their chances of selection diminished to nothing. These forgotten women, some still in their 20s but considered past their prime, faced decades of irrelevance. They became ghost-like figures in the palace, technically still concubines, but practically invisible. Some found purpose in teaching younger women, passing on the survival skills needed to navigate the palace's dangers. Others retreated into opium dreams or religious devotion, seeking escape from a reality too painful to endure. The few concubines who survived to old age often became repositories of the palace's darkest secrets. They had witnessed decades of abuse, corruption, and tragedy, but speaking of these things was forbidden. Some left cryptic memoirs, hidden in palace walls or sewn into clothing, hoping future generations might understand their suffering. Others took their stories to the grave, the full extent of their experiences dying with them in the cold earth outside Beijing's walls. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1912, the liberation of the Forbidden City's concubines revealed the true scope of the system's horrors. Journalists and reformers who entered the palace found women who had not left the compound in decades, who spoke in whispers from habit, who flinched at sudden movements. Some concubines, when told they were free to leave, simply had nowhere to go, their families long dead, their natal homes forgotten, their entire existence defined by the walls that had imprisoned them. The testimonies gathered from these survivors paint a picture of systematic dehumanization that went far beyond sexual exploitation. The crawling, the silence, the forced abortions, these were not isolated cruelties but part of a comprehensive system designed to break women's spirits and reduce them to compliant objects. The fact that this system persisted for nearly 3 centuries, involving hundreds of thousands of women, speaks to the terrifying efficiency of institutional oppression when backed by absolute power. Modern historians studying the Qing harem system have uncovered additional layers of horror in the palace archives. Detailed logs kept by eunuchs reveal the business-like nature of the exploitation. Women reduced to entries in ledgers, their encounters timed and rated, their pregnancies tracked like agricultural yields. These records, preserved in the name of imperial efficiency, now serve as evidence of one of history's most organized systems of sexual slavery. The medical records are particularly disturbing. Palace physicians documented the physical damage inflicted by the forced abortion massages, internal bleeding, organ damage, permanent infertility. They noted these injuries with clinical detachment, prescribing herbs and rest before declaring the women fit for service again. The cycle of violence was literally written into the medical protocols. Each woman's suffering reduced to brushstrokes on silk scrolls that still exist in museum archives today. Perhaps most chilling are the financial records showing the economy that grew around the harem system. Eunuchs who grew wealthy selling influence, merchants who specialized in fertility drugs and abortion-inducing herbs, even architects who designed palace additions specifically to house more concubines, all profited from the misery of trapped women. The commodification of female bodies extended beyond the palace walls, creating an entire industry dedicated to supporting and perpetuating the system. The psychological studies of harem survivors conducted in the early Republican period revealed trauma patterns that modern psychiatrists recognize as complex PTSD. The women exhibited symptoms including dissociation, hypervigilance, sexual dysfunction, and profound difficulties with trust and intimacy. Many could not sleep without lights, decades after leaving the palace. Others compulsively hoarded food, unable to shake the fear of the deprivation used as punishment. The invisible scars lasted far longer than the physical ones. The impact on Chinese society extended beyond the palace walls. The harem system created a model of gender relations that normalized extreme control over women's bodies and sexuality. The idea that women's primary value lay in their beauty and fertility, that their voices should be silenced, that their consent was irrelevant, these concepts filtered down through social classes, shaping marriage practices and family structures throughout the empire. The emperor's treatment of his concubines set a standard that countless men attempted to emulate on smaller scales. International observers during the late Qing period were both fascinated and horrified by the harem system. Western diplomats' wives, who were occasionally allowed to visit the Forbidden City, wrote shocked accounts of meeting concubines who seemed like beautiful automatons, trained to such perfection in submission that they had lost any sense of individual personality. These accounts, while sometimes colored by Orientalist prejudices, provide outside perspectives on a system that those within it were forbidden to critique. The fall of the Qing dynasty didn't immediately end the suffering of former concubines. Many faced destitution as they had no skills for life outside the palace and carried the stigma of their former positions. Some were murdered by revolutionary forces who saw them as symbols of imperial decadence. Others committed suicide, unable to adapt to a world where they were expected to make choices after decades of having every decision made for them. The liberation of the concubines became another tragedy in their long history of suffering. In the decades following the dynasty's collapse, efforts to help former concubines revealed the deep psychological programming they had endured. Social workers reported that many women continued to follow palace protocols, even in freedom, crawling to approach authority figures, remaining silent unless given explicit permission to speak, flinching at any physical contact. Deprogramming these behaviors took years when it was successful at all. Some women never fully recovered their sense of personal agency. Today, the Forbidden City stands as a tourist attraction where millions walk through the same corridors where concubines were carried like packages. The beautiful architecture and ornate decorations mask the suffering that occurred within these walls. Tour guides speak of emperors and empresses, of art and culture, but rarely mention the thousands of women who lived and died in sexual slavery. Their stories, when told at all, are often romanticized into tales of palace intrigue rather than recognized as testimonies of systematic abuse. The legacy of the Qing harem system continues to influence contemporary discussions about gender, power, and consent in China and beyond. Feminist scholars point to the harem as an extreme example of patriarchal control, while others debate whether modern forms of sexual exploitation have roots in these historical practices. The conversations are difficult but necessary, forcing society to confront how power structures can transform intimacy into violence and desire into degradation. What makes the Qing harem system particularly disturbing is not just its cruelty, but its bureaucratic efficiency. This was not chaotic violence, but organized oppression, not individual sadism, but institutional dehumanization. Every aspect was documented, regulated, and optimized for maximum control. The fact that educated, cultured men designed and maintained this system for centuries challenges comfortable notions about civilization and progress. It forces us to recognize that sophistication and brutality can coexist, that beautiful palaces can be sites of profound horror. As we look back on the stories of these concubines, forced to crawl in darkness, silenced in their suffering, reduced to wombs with legs, we must resist the temptation to see their experiences as mere historical curiosity. These were real women with dreams, fears, and desires, who found themselves trapped in a system that denied their humanity at every turn. Their crawling was not exotic ritual, but calculated humiliation. Their silence was not mysterious Oriental custom, but enforced voicelessness. Their suffering was not ancient history, but a warning about what happens when human beings are reduced to objects for the pleasure of the powerful. The wooden tablets bearing concubines' names have long since rotted away, but the women they represented deserve to be remembered as more than victims. They were survivors who found ways to persist in impossible circumstances, who formed friendships and alliances despite the system's attempts to isolate them, who sometimes managed to carve out small spaces of autonomy within their golden cages. Their resistance, however limited, their humanity, however suppressed, stands as testament to the ultimate failure of even the most comprehensive systems of oppression to completely crush the human spirit. In the end, the story of the Qing dynasty's concubines is not just about sexual exploitation or historical cruelty. It's about power, how it corrupts, how it dehumanizes both those who wield it and those who suffer under it, how it transforms the most intimate human connections into transactions of dominance and submission. The emperor who received a crawling woman in his bed was as trapped in this system as she was, his humanity diminished by participating in her degradation. The eunuchs who carried out the abuse were both perpetrators and victims, their own mutilation a reminder of the system's willingness to destroy anyone in service of maintaining control. Today, as we walk through museums displaying the silk robes and golden ornaments of imperial concubines, we should remember that these beautiful objects adorned women who lived in daily terror. Each piece of jewelry was worn by someone who might be forced to crawl naked across a cold floor that very night. Each painting of a beautiful concubine represents someone whose voice was stolen, whose body was not her own, whose life was measured in moments of sexual availability to a man who saw her as disposable. The Forbidden City's walls no longer imprison women, but they still hold the echoes of those who suffered within them. If we listen carefully to history, we can hear the silence of the concubines, not the romantic quiet of Oriental mystery, but the enforced muteness of systematic oppression. We can see their crawling, not as erotic performance, but as the physical manifestation of absolute power over the powerless. We can understand their story not as ancient history, but as a warning. This is what happens when human beings are reduced to objects, when power goes unchecked, when the suffering of the vulnerable is institutionalized and rationalized in the name of tradition, order, or divine mandate. The last Qing concubine died in 1975, taking with her the living memory of the palace system, but the records remain. The careful notation of each woman selected, each encounter timed, each pregnancy prevented or permitted. These documents, preserved in archives around the world, ensure that the truth cannot be buried with the victims. They stand as evidence that behind the beauty of imperial China lay a systematic brutalization of women that lasted for centuries, touched hundreds of thousands of lives, and left scars on Chinese society that are still healing today. As our journey through this dark chapter of history concludes, we're left with uncomfortable questions. How many women crawled through darkness while poets wrote of palace beauty? How many remained silent while historians recorded imperial glory? How many suffered while the world admired Chinese civilization from afar? The answers lie buried with the concubines themselves, but their legacy demands that we remember not the romanticized version of palace life, but the brutal reality. In the heart of one of history's greatest empires, women were forced to crawl to their own violation, and an entire society conspired to call it culture. The gilded cages of the Forbidden City are now empty, their doors thrown open to tourists and sunlight. But in the shadows of the restored bedchambers, in the silence of the abandoned quarters, the ghosts of the concubines remain. They do not ask for pity. They lived beyond pity. They do not seek revenge. They died beyond justice. They simply demand what they were denied in life, to be seen as human beings whose suffering mattered, whose stories deserved telling, whose lives were more than footnotes in the biographies of emperors. In remembering their crawling, we honor their humanity. In acknowledging their silence, we finally give them voice. In facing the horror of what was done to them, we commit ourselves to never allowing power to so absolutely corrupt the sacred connections between human beings again.